The palace corridors were never truly silent. Even at night, when lanterns flickered like dying stars, whispers slid through the carved wooden screens. In the Tang dynasty's heart, where emperors and concubines performed their eternal theater, a young girl named Wu Zhao stepped into a world soaked in incense, silk, and secrets. To some, she was only another ornament among hundreds, but if you leaned closer, you could almost sense the fire waiting behind her eyes, the hunger that made her different. She was not born to fade into the shadows. She was born to bend them. Imagine the suffocating weight of brocade gowns, the cloying perfume of rivals, the constant tug of unseen strings, every gesture a calculation, every glance a weapon. And yet, Wu Zhao smiled, bowed, and listened. She understood early that in this place, beauty was both a curse and a key. Those who used it recklessly perished quickly. Those who sharpened it into a blade could carve their way to the throne. You, standing here among these silken halls, would probably not survive a single moon cycle. Before diving into these forgotten stories of survival and suffering, if you enjoy learning about the hidden truths of history, consider hitting that like button and subscribing for more content like this. And please comment below to let me know where you're listening from. Wu Zhao began as a minor concubine of Emperor Taizong, the second emperor of the Tang dynasty. History records her as clever, quick-witted, and unafraid to speak in situations where other women trembled into silence. It was unusual, dangerous even, for a concubine to reveal too much mind. Yet Taizong noticed. She learned poetry, philosophy, and the art of conversation as carefully as one might learn swordplay. That was the accepted fact. She was no ordinary girl in the harem's suffocating maze. But the lesser-known detail is that Wu Zhao also mastered the subtler arts of attention, how to lower her gaze just enough to appear submissive, how to ask a question that flattered while sounding innocent, how to dress in hues that mirrored the emperor's mood. She calculated like an astrologer charting the heavens. While others fought openly for notice, she made herself unforgettable by never seeming to try. Historians still argue whether she truly captured Taizong's favor in a romantic sense or whether her influence came more from her wit than from the emperor's bed. Some suggest that he admired her intellect but kept her at a careful distance, wary of her ambition. Others whisper that she was already practicing the very art she would perfect later, becoming indispensable not by desire alone, but by becoming the one voice in a crowd of silence that dared to speak the truth he wanted to hear. When Taizong died, custom dictated that Wu Zhao should shave her head and live out her years as a Buddhist nun. For most women, this would have been the end of their story, buried alive within monastery walls. But Wu Zhao was already rehearsing her second act. Behind the chanting prayers and drifting incense, her mind calculated. Fate had locked her away, but she would find the key. And when the doors opened again, she would not simply step back into the palace, she would march toward its throne. The girl was becoming the shadow that would one day eclipse the sun. The convent bells tolled at dawn, their hollow chime echoing against bare stone. For most women cast aside from the imperial harem, this was where their story ended: shaven heads, empty bowls, and silence until death. Wu Zhao stood among them, dressed in plain robes, her beauty veiled under austerity. But while the others resigned themselves to obscurity, she nurtured a secret resolve. The monastery was not her coffin, it was her waiting room. Imagine being forced into a life of chanting sutras, the incense thick enough to choke, while knowing that beyond the gates lay silk halls and the thrones of men. You might crumble, but Wu Zhao whispered to herself in the stillness, "This is not my fate." She had studied too much of human weakness in the palace to surrender now. Survival, she knew, was not just about breath. It was about keeping ambition alive when others believed it was buried. History records that when Emperor Taizong died, his son, Emperor Gaozong, inherited both the throne and Wu Zhao's lingering presence in memory. Whether by chance or careful orchestration, Gaozong visited the convent. When he saw Wu Zhao again, eyes sharp as ever, wit still razor-edged, something shifted. The accepted fact is that he summoned her back to court, breaking centuries of tradition that consigned imperial concubines of one emperor to permanent exile. The Tang court gasped in scandal, but Gaozong was enchanted and Wu Zhao seized her second chance. The disturbing lesser-known detail is the way she allegedly manipulated this return. Some chronicles hint that Wu Zhao's encounters with Gaozong were not entirely innocent. One tale claims she composed verses about the futility of life behind convent walls, lacing each poem with longing and subtle seduction. Another story whispers that she let tears fall at just the right moment, reminding him of the injustice of her confinement. Perhaps Gaozong believed he was rescuing her. In truth, she was reeling him into her net. Historians still argue whether Gaozong's decision was purely personal passion, or whether Wu Zhao engineered her recall with uncanny foresight. Some suggest that Empress Wang herself, Gaozong's official wife, approved of Wu Zhao's return, hoping to use her as a counterbalance against another powerful consort. If that is true, then Empress Wang unknowingly delivered her greatest rival straight into her own chambers, a fatal miscalculation that would unravel her life. Back in the palace, Wu Zhao no longer played the shy concubine. She understood the court was a battlefield disguised in silks and painted smiles. Gaozong leaned on her not only for comfort, but also for counsel. She whispered strategies when he faltered, read his moods before ministers dared to speak, and became the quiet force that steadied the emperor's hand. Imagine standing in those gilded halls, watching a woman once dismissed as forgotten nun slowly outmaneuver men born into centuries of power. You might smirk at the irony. Sometimes the convent teaches more cunning than the court. Her rivals noticed. Empress Wang, once so certain of her position, began to feel the ground slip beneath her feet. Other concubines whispered with venom, yet none could compete with Wu Zhao's patience. She did not strike immediately. Like a spider, she spun her web strand by strand, waiting for the right prey to stumble. And when that moment came, history would remember her not just as a survivor, but as a predator cloaked in silk. The convent gates had not closed her life, they had opened her legend. No decree shook the Tang court as thoroughly as a whisper well placed. The palace was an echo chamber where rumors did not travel, they multiplied. Screens carved with phoenixes hid 1,000 listening ears. Lacquered corridors funneled sound like flutes. In that thick, perfumed air, Wu Zhao discovered that speech could march like soldiers and kill like steel. She did not need to roar. She only needed to choose the right ear. You picture court intrigue as daggers and duels. But here, the sharper weapon was a syllable. A sigh outside the emperor's study could translate into a minister's demotion. A raised eyebrow during a poetry recital, that could cost a clan its fortune. Wu learned the grammar of power as if it were a new script, where pauses mattered more than words, and silence could thunder louder than accusation. If gossip were currency, the imperial treasury would never run dry. The accepted fact anchoring this swirl, Empress Wang, Gaozong's official wife, was childless. Wu Zhao bore sons. She would eventually give the dynasty heirs, boys whose names would haunt later chronicles. Li Hong, Li Sheng, Li Dan, future crown princes, future emperors. In a world where bloodlines were the hinges of empire, that difference alone turned the tide beneath her feet. She did not crow about it. She simply let biology argue her case, while she perfected the art of being indispensable. But she did more than wait. Within the harem's nested courts, she built a lattice of quiet loyalties. Seamstresses who dressed the empress, eunuchs who carried memorials, copyists who handled drafts before they reached the dragon throne. The lesser-known, unsettling detail. Some say Wu arranged for early peeks at ministerial petitions, reading them before Gaozong ever did, so that her counsel could arrive like prophecy. Imagine advising someone on a letter they haven't opened yet. In a palace where even wallpaper had ears, the walls might as well have filed reports. Her rivals, among them the beautiful consort Xiao, had grown used to winning the day with a dazzling hairpin or a poem that made the emperor smile. Wu played a slower game. She asked after an ailing aunt of a mid-ranking official and remembered the name months later. She sent a spare physician to a guard's sick child, then forgot to mention it, allowing gratitude to ripen without show. She elevated kindness the way a general positions supply lines, strategically, invisibly, fatally effective when the battle begins. Whisper soon acquired a choreography. When an ambitious censor scolded Gao Zong too bluntly, a scribe murmured that the man had used a risky turn of phrase, disloyal at best, treasonous at worst. The phrase repeated itself 2 rooms away and became a warning. 3 rooms later, it turned into an outrage. 4 rooms after that, a memorial asked for investigation. By sunset, the censor was home early, contemplating how quickly the floor had tilted. If you insisted on speaking truth to power here, you first had to speak carefully to servants. Historians still argue whether Wu herself directed these currents like a conductor, or whether her allies, some of them eager to secure their own advancement, created the swell and she simply learned to surf it. Names like Su Jing Song surface in the annals, officials who prospered under her star, men skilled at lubricating the machinery of reputation. Was she the architect, or the weather system that made their plots thunder? Scholars quarrel over agency. The results, however, looked remarkably consistent. In this theater of carefully managed impressions, Wu's greatest performance was intimacy itself. She could be warm and watchful at once, a hand on the emperor's wrist as she quietly dismantled a minister's argument, a laugh at a jest that disarmed a room before she introduced a small suggestion. You might have found yourself agreeing with her before realizing you were nodding. She embodied the most dangerous sort of persuasion, the kind that felt like your own idea. And still, she understood danger. Every favor demanded a counterfavor. Every ally cast a shadow. She kept her circles overlapping, but never identical, so that no single group could fence her in. When 2 factions praised her with equal fervor, she smiled and gave each a different errand. If both jobs succeeded, she benefited. If one failed, the other survived to carry her forward. It is an odd comfort to know that redundancy wasn't invented by bureaucrats. It flowered first in palaces. The palace women who served at her mirror saw how she rehearsed her expressions, the exact degree of sorrow to show at the empress's misstep, the measured delight at another consort's poem, the blank calm that told a pettier rival she was not worth the effort. A joke was a blade hidden in the sleeve, flattery, a silk cord. She could suspend an insult in midair with a soft smile and let the room decide that it had never been spoken. In a court ruled by whispers, the victor was the one who controlled what people remembered. Even the rituals bent to her tempo. During festival days, when lanterns bled gold and red across the lake, she hovered near Gaozong with the grace of a favored star, but never too near. She let the emperor reach for her, as if the decision were always his. When he faltered under migraines and indecision, she stepped in, like clarity given human shape. Perhaps, she would say, and an entire policy shifted, an inch, then a foot, then a mile. You know the type. The person who brings a cup of tea and somehow leaves with a kingdom. By now, those who had underestimated the former nun felt the ground cooling under their toes. Empress Wang sensed it too, a fine tremor in the bones of the palace. She tried diplomacy. She tried distance. She tried, as the chronicles suggest, enlisting Wu to counter consort Xiao, only to discover that borrowed knives have their own ambitions. The empress commanded ceremony. Wu commanded attention. Between the two, attention won. One night, choose any night, there were many, the wind teased the palace banners, and laughter tinkled from a far courtyard where musicians rehearsed for a banquet. In Gaozong's chamber, a minister's name flickered like a moth in a lamplight, while Wu's voice lingered, low and patient. Outside, a maid adjusted a lantern and did not hear that a career had just ended. The empire did not tremble, it merely tilted, an imperceptible degree, toward a woman who spoke softly enough to be believed. Soon enough, the whispers would sharpen into accusations, and the accusations into trials. But for now, the court still pretended that everything was poetry and etiquette, a mask that allowed people to believe their world was gentle It was not. It was being rewritten in a script that Wu Zhao alone could read. And if you think you could stroll through those corridors and keep your footing, consider this. At the Tang court, it was cheaper to raise an army than to raise an eyebrow. The storm gathered without thunder. Everyone heard it anyway. The Tang throne, for all its carved dragons and golden curtains, was not as steady as it looked. Emperor Gaozong, though adorned with imperial titles, often suffered from dizzy spells and blinding headaches, maladies that left him vulnerable to influence. In the hush that followed these migraines, a voice would lean close, steady, patient, offering counsel, while the empire held its breath. That voice belonged to Wu Zhao. What began as whispers in the harem soon became the voice that guided the Emperor of China. Picture the scene. Gaozong reclines, temples throbbing, while ministers drone over taxes and troop deployments. You, standing at the edge of the hall, would see his brow crease in agony. Then Wu Zhao steps forward, her hand cool against his wrist, her words clear where his vision falters. She was more than consort, more than comfort. She became interpreter of his empire. If emperors were supposed to radiate certainty, here was one who leaned upon a woman for clarity, and a woman who made that dependency permanent.
The accepted fact is that Gaozong began granting Wu Zhao seats beside him during councils, an extraordinary break from tradition. At first, she was silent, the perfect image of supportive modesty. Then, little by little, she spoke, a reminder of a precedent, a suggestion of leniency here, a warning of danger there. Ministers grumbled, but Gaozong silenced them, sometimes harshly. With each intervention, Wu Zhao's voice grew louder until it became impossible to separate his decisions from her advice. The lesser-known detail drawn from uneasy chronicles is that Wu Zhao sometimes prepared decisions in advance by cultivating informants among the ministers themselves. Reports claim she would know the contents of a debate before it unfolded, allowing her to predict outcomes or deliver solutions that seemed almost prophetic. Imagine being a courtier, smug about your clever proposal, only to find the emperor nodding as Wu Zhao articulates it more gracefully than you could. It was as though she stole your thought, polished it, and returned it to thunderous applause. And yet, scholars still debate whether Gaozong was truly weak or simply pragmatic. Some argue he recognized Wu Zhao's intelligence and used her as his partner, content to let her bear the burden of politics. Others paint him as a puppet, strings tangled in her hands. The truth may lie somewhere in between, an ailing emperor who preferred poetry to policy, and a woman ambitious enough to carry both his frailty and the empire's weight. It was in this fragile balance that Empress Wang tried to assert her fading authority. She sponsored rituals, performed duties, and attempted to remind the empire of her rightful place. But Wu Zhao had what she lacked: sons. In the harem's ledger, nothing outweighed heirs. Still, Wang plotted alliances, hoping to check the rising tide. One version of events even suggests she entertained the idea of adopting Wu's children, as if claiming them could dilute Wu's power. But Wu Zhao's ambition was not the kind to be shared. Here, the palace atmosphere thickened into dread. Concubines exchanged nervous glances during banquets. Ministers debated how far Wu's influence might extend. One courtier supposedly muttered that the empire had 2 emperors, though only one wore the crown. That was dangerous talk. Gaozong himself dismissed such whispers, yet his actions betrayed the truth. He trusted Wu Zhao's judgment more than his own officials. If loyalty was currency, she had already outbid them all. The irony is sharp enough to draw blood. Confucian ideals insisted that women remain passive, obedient, silent. And yet, in the most refined court of its age, the survival of policy, military campaigns, and even ritual depended on a woman's voice. You could almost hear the ancestors stirring uncomfortably in their tombs. If irony had a sound, it would be the scraping of jade tablets recording decrees half-shaped by a concubine. Still, Wu Zhao understood that influence without fear is fragile. She began testing boundaries, proposing harsher measures against disloyal ministers, suggesting swift punishments that made the court shudder. Some of these punishments, though not yet the infamous cruelties to come, hinted at her philosophy. Terror was a language even cowards understood fluently. Gaozong, wearied by illness, often let her decide. Thus, the empire's tone shifted subtly, like music modulated to a darker key. When Gao Zong looked at Wu Zhao, he saw solace. When the court looked at her, it saw inevitability. She was no longer a concubine returned from exile, no longer merely a clever partner. She was becoming the emperor's right hand, and, in many ways, his right mind. Power had moved again in the palace, not with a clash of swords, but with the careful rise of a woman who knew how to wait until the emperor's shadow bent to her shape. And as the court tried to reassure itself that this was temporary, that Gao Zong's health would improve, a single truth whispered louder than any decree. If you wanted something done in the empire of Tang, you no longer begged the Son of Heaven, you sought the ear of Wu Zhao.
From this moment, the mask slipped. Wu Zhao revealed not only her brilliance, but her cruelty. She knew fear carved deeper scars than persuasion ever could. Ministers who opposed her met strange accidents. Eunuchs who spread gossip vanished into prison cells. Torture chambers became instruments of policy. And in one infamous decree she ordered rebels skinned alive, punishment not just to kill, but to terrify. You can almost hear the rustle of court robes as ministers bowed lower than ever, praying not to be next. It would be easy to imagine this as chaos, but paradoxically, the empire flourished. Agriculture expanded, taxes were organized, and the Silk Road pulsed with trade. Wu Zhao ruled with blood in one hand and prosperity in the other. Even scholars who loathed her had to admit that roads were safer, granaries fuller. The irony bites. Her reign of terror also became a reign of order. Imagine living in that world, where your family ate better than ever before, but every dinner was shadowed by the thought that a careless word could end it. Prosperity tasted metallic, like rice flavored with iron. Still, the edges of her dynasty frayed with time. Gao Zong's health collapsed entirely, leaving her the de facto ruler. She reshaped rituals to sanctify her rule, citing omens and prophecies that named her destiny. In a final act of audacity, she crowned herself not as empress consort, but as emperor in her own right, founding the Zhou dynasty in 690. The heavens, she declared, had chosen her. Whether the gods agreed was irrelevant. The empire obeyed. And yet, power is a storm even its master cannot tame forever. In her later years, illness and betrayal sapped her strength. Factions plotted, ministers schemed, and her once unquestionable dominance began to unravel. By the time she was forced to abdicate, the woman who had outplayed emperors and outlived rivals faced the same silence she had once escaped in the convent, a final decline shrouded in suspicion. Her legacy, though, refuses silence. Was she a monster who strangled her own child, a visionary who ruled an empire with brilliance, or both? She remains a riddle carved in jade and blood. Even now, scholars argue, unable to decide whether to curse her name or admire her courage. Perhaps that is her greatest triumph, that history itself cannot bury her. You walk away from her story uneasy, as if the palace walls are still whispering, because in a way they are. They remind you that survival is never free, power never gentle, and that sometimes the price of ruling the world is written in your own child's blood.